Okay. Well, I hope everybody had a decent lunch. I hope everybody enjoyed the morning, because I know I did. This is a panel which is pretty interesting to me. I spend a lot of time sort of trying to build data science teams, trying to convince our CEO that we're doing a good job, trying to convince people on our board that we're doing a good job, and actually trying to do a good job. Thanks, Scott. So this is a pretty interesting, unique group of people. We have Rob, our CTO. Actually, we've already met. I'll start over here. Pete's a principal data scientist at LinkedIn, which is probably one of the best known data science groups in the world. And I've known Pete for a really long time. I was his TA, actually, in physics class. And I was going to make fun of him last night because I thought he was in the pre-med physics class. But then he made fun of me because I couldn't remember that he wasn't in the pre-med physics class. So
I think I was actually your undergrad TA helping you with the
that's right.
pre-med
See,
physics class.
so now I'm just an old idiot. Thanks, Pete. We have Joseph Turian here, who I've seen talk at Strata before, and we just recently met. He heads up Meta Optimize. He's very well known in the NLP space and runs a forum, Meta Optimize NLP forum, which is really well trafficked.
Machine learning and natural language processing.
And so he does a lot of, or has done a lot of consulting and seen a lot of data science groups and data groups and companies. So we're curious to see or hear his perspective on some of these topics. And then next to him we have Ashu Garg. Ashu actually sits on the board of Aggregate Knowledge, and he's a partner at the venture capital firm First Round. So I thought it'd be really interesting to hear. Foundation. God, I have that written wrong. Boy.
You know the guys who paid for this.
I like that.
Sorry, Ashu.
That's okay.
But I thought it'd be really interesting to hear his perspective from sort of not really inside a company, but from looking at other companies and sort of his portfolio of companies that he invests in and how he evaluates whether they're doing a good job and what it means to be sort of successful in a research environment from a VC's perspective. So I think it's going to be a pretty interesting group. And I guess, where did we start off here, Rob?
Go to the format.
What's that? Oh, yeah, so I think we'll have a pretty loose format here. Hopefully these guys are all going to talk and ask questions of each other. If anybody actually from the audience wants to chime in, I think that'd probably be pretty interesting. So kind of make this really casual and a decent conversation. Fair enough? So I guess I'd like to start sort of from the highest level. If we think about Ashu as sort of overseeing companies, we think of Rob as a CTO sort of overseeing sort of data science teams, and we think of Pete sort of as the data science guy sort of running things, and we have Joseph with this sort of in and out, seeing lots of different teams. We'll start with Ashu and ask him, what do you see and what do you think is a sort of a successful makeup of research for companies, and what does data science look when it looks good to you in a startup?
I think the biggest challenge in connecting research to startups and sort of in the data science space, but I think more broadly as well, is finding the right balance between research, which often has a 3, 5, and in some cases 10-year sort of view of the world, and startups which are mostly thinking sort of in 3, 5, 6 months sort of views of the world. And so it's that balance. And I think if you can find problems that excite researchers that are taking a longer-term view, they're very often platform-oriented problems or fundamental sort of horizontal technology problems, but also have sort of short-term applications of those. I think that's when you find success. And I think that's sort of where magic happens. And we've seen it in a lot of companies in our portfolio.
I'm curious, what have you seen that's sort of been bad? How do you define not success?
I think so. I think we've had our share of failures in terms of. So just as context, we've probably had, as Foundation's been around for 20 years, and we've probably had a dozen or so companies which we've spun out of universities or research groups, or have been the basis of research projects in universities. I can think of one sort of example which was a complete failure, and I think the issue was really this mismatch between the time frame. The research, in this particular case, it was a solid state fan, and so the technology was to eliminate the need for fans, fans in rooms and offices and so on, but more importantly, fans in laptops and computers. It was a solid state cooling system, which, if it worked, would be transformational. It would change sort of cooling across all kinds of electronic devices. But really, we spun it out of Purdue University. It was a research project in Purdue. They'd worked on it for 5-6 years. The professor and his entire research team spun out, moved to the Bay Area, and set up the company. And I think what we found as they started to implement it, they really did have another 3 to 5 years of research to go before there was a product that could go into a laptop. And we thought they had 12 months to go before they had a product to go to a laptop. And I think that mismatch was the cause of failure. It was amazing technology, it still is. But most VCs, we like to take a lot of risk, but we're also hugely risk averse. And so funding something, for 3 to 5 years is just not something that sort of fits our model.
Sure. Makes sense. What about, I guess we'll go down one level then. What about Rob? I mean, as a CTO, you're sort of talking to Ashu and sort of talking to guys like me further down the chain. How have you seen that work, and how do you see your role in that?
In the data science teams, or in the
Well, I guess research in general, but I mean,
what works and what doesn't work?
we're in 2013, so data science.
What's interesting is I think Ashu's statement is exactly true at all the different levels of what we're working on. Because I can't bring an idea up to my boss or to Ashu that is 12 months out or whatever. So every idea that we have, it's our delivery that it has to deliver on a business value within a release cycle or within a few release cycles, whatever that is, and trying to peanut butter that across a longer release cycle for a 6-month release cycle. So you have these little mini releases in there that you're trying to get this incremental growth towards some larger term idea. Like I couldn't take a nascent idea that, just as with the solid state idea, that couldn't potentially be productionizable in a year or something like that. That's not even a project that I can even contemplate tackling, because there's just no way that I could protect that team and allow that to continue, because you constantly have this business feedback that's like, is it there yet? Did it get delivered? Where is something that I can see? And if there's still that 12 months of research to go before that, and again, I'm only speaking obviously from a small company standpoint. I have to imagine that the larger companies like IBM and some of these other companies that have the ability to support an internal team that can take on these longer time frames. But again, from our standpoint, we have to be able to touch on things that are, at most 2 iterations away from being conceptualized. And then yes, it may take longer to get it productionalized, but it can't be that nascent that you need to take a year or so to get to it.
Well, I mean, Pete, you're sort of in that almost bigger company phase now. So how do you answer that question?
I think that's a really challenging question. I think about that myself almost every day. We're in a planning process right now for a project, and this is the exact dilemma that we face, which is you may have the holy grail, like the big thing where if you integrate with team X or system X, that gives you 90% of your value. So I think the challenge that I see is, and as researchers, you may see like the vision of where this could go, and there's some major use case, which is the most important. Then there are these smaller incremental pieces that may be, okay, this quarter or 3 months from now, 4 months from now, but that's not really the big thing you're after. And I think the real challenge is how do you keep the team focused and the company focused on this is the big thing we're after, and it's going to be down the road. This little thing that we're delivering right now is only a fraction of that. And how do you get the team not lost in the weeds of supporting all these small use cases, right?
Yeah, and managing those expectations, because as soon as you show the first thing to the business, they're already growing 5 steps forward, and you're like, we didn't get to our first step yet, much less we're on 6th step.
Yeah, I think that's for me. I think focus on the most important case and really push for that. And if it is a year out or if it's 9 months out and you really believe in it and you're going to gamble on it, I think you need to take some risks. But then you also need to deliver on that. And if you can't, then you also need to be willing to kind of cancel some of these things. So I think that's the difference, is that if you fail in a startup or a business, like there's a lot riding on it, and you want to fail fast if you can.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, it seems like you're talking about like these broader research agendas. I mean, in terms of actionable advice, it's important to have buy-in from all the relevant stakeholders. And that's sort of a way of also keeping it real, right? Because if you're talking to I don't know, people that are technologists, and you're like, well, I'm trying to make this 20% faster. And they're like, does that really matter? Like, maybe 20% is not actually a big deal, right? Or, obviously the business use case is keeping it real with the expectations, managing expectations. How do we know when we're going to call it if this project if this investigatory work just does not pan out, right? Deciding that in advance is important.
Yeah.
The last thing is I think another in terms of, I guess, shorter term agendas, reuse, I think, is sort of an interesting thing to keep in mind, and in particular. I found that generally any tools that you build for exploratory analysis is generally time very well spent. So, like, my advisor in grad school said, as much as possible, keep all your data in text files, because then you will look at your data as much as possible. And that sort of hack. So anything that really helps you, like, investigate and explore, I think that's always time well spent.
Ashu, you talked about sort of a failure. I guess, Pete, you're talking about failing fast. Like, can you give some examples of, maybe projects that you guys work on, and you just say, look, guys, we got to stop?
I don't know if I want to give specific examples of projects that I've failed on. There would be a long list probably here. But no, I think that's important, and I think for myself, I like to be on teams and in companies where we use the kind of the phrase like open, honest, and constructive. Both when we were talking about this at dinner last night, when somebody gives a talk, what kind of questions or feedback do you have during the talk? But all the way to the level of, like, with a project, people need to feel comfortable making it about the work and not about the person in the team. Like, you're investing a lot of your energy into something, but people need to feel comfortable and be objective. And I think the research, that's where research in startups, I think, can lend some level of objectivity and say, look, this really isn't working. Let's take a slightly different direction, and that happens, right? It's a risky business.
So, Matt, I'd love to talk about a couple of successes more than the failures. So, there's two companies I'd like to quickly sort of talk about. One is a company called Atheros. I don't know how many people are familiar with Atheros. Qualcomm acquired them a couple of years ago for a nice chunk of change. They were the original inventors of Wi-Fi. And it started off as a research project in Stanford by Professor Teresa Ming. And at the time, her research was simply around how do you implement sort of analog sort of radios in CMOS. I mean, traditionally radios had been done in analog and hadn't been implemented in CMOS. And so you did have some Wi-Fi chips. The standards weren't sort of, solidified, but you had chips, but they were, analog chips and very expensive because they were using exotic materials. And so she didn't even have at the time an idea that you would solve the Wi-Fi problem. But what was very important was she actually had something that could be implemented in that case, in the case of semiconductors, 3 years is a short time. So they could actually get product out in a couple of years. And what we were able to do was to pair her with the person who was driving the Wi-Fi initiative at 3Com, which, a long time ago was actually a meaningful company. And they were sort of driving Wi-Fi at the time. And Rich Ridelf, who's now a partner at Foundation, joined Teresa as her co-founder. And the two of them, essentially sort of combining his knowledge of Wi-Fi and the marketing and the protocols and the standards, and her knowledge of how to implement sort of radios on CMOS, resulted in what eventually was a $7-8 billion sort of outcome for us. The other example more recently is a company called Conviva, which I'm currently on the board of, and Spark, was invented essentially at Conviva. And it was invented because we had a business problem. We were solving for real-time optimization of video. And most of the big data technologies, sort of a couple of years ago, the company's been around for 4 or 5 years, we had built the optimization layer, but to feed the algorithms, we needed something that was real-time. And for us, real-time at the time was 200 milliseconds or less. And we also needed something that was programmable and actionable. And it didn't exist. And so the co-founder of the company is a person called Jan Stoika, who's a professor at Berkeley. Jan sort of took that problem back to his research students and essentially And coming out of he had a very deep understanding of the problem space. And the reason I bring this example up in detail is I think this is where success happens. Jan had a very, very deep understanding of the problem because he had founded the company, he'd been involved for the last 5 years, and he understood the contours of what would work and what wouldn't. And he was then able to take that back and at Berkeley get the big data lab at Berkeley excited enough about the broader opportunity beyond Conviva so that the university would commit a large amount of its research budget and a large number of research students to the project. So Matai, who is credited with doing a lot of the pioneering work in that space, was Jan's student. And we were able to go back and forth. We became the alpha customer for the technology at Conviva, developed it. Half the employees at Conviva went back and forth to the lab. We ended up hiring half of the students from that lab. And so I think success happens when you can find some way to marry an immediate problem, which provides focus, with a technical breakthrough, which is interesting long term for a research group.
As you're speaking, I mean, it sounds like you do a lot of introductions between companies and like academics, like you're talking about Berkeley and Stoica. How much of your time is actually spent talking to, let's say, like a CEO, and then reaching out and looking around the world and seeing what research groups might be beneficial to that company? Do you do a lot of introductions of that sort? Is that?
We do a fair number. I think in terms of how often I get to talk to Rob, that depends on David, whenever he allows me to. But more broadly, I think a lot of it just happens through the network of the firm and the research groups we know, and it helps when people at places like LinkedIn and Google and others and Microsoft Research decide to leave, and that's often a source of talent for us as well.
Yeah, I mean, we have a couple academic talks coming up too, and Muth is here, and it's been somewhat of a challenge for a company like Aggregate Knowledge to bridge that gap and leverage the fact that Microsoft actually has devoted research teams for these guys can spend years on a problem, and we can't, right? We're a startup. I guess maybe I'll ask you, Pete, like how does a company of the size of LinkedIn, I mean, you've been there for a while when they weren't quite as big, what kind of interaction did you have? Did you leverage anything like that, or is all the technology built in-house?
Well, I think LinkedIn is a special case. I was talking to someone again last night about our technology stack, and a lot of it is developed in-house. So things like Kafka, Voldemort, a lot of the open source technologies in this big data NoSQL space that have been pretty successful. On the research front, I'd say a good chunk of the team that I'm on specifically is a data products team. So data science and research at LinkedIn is actually spread across a number of different organizations. We have engineering, we have product, security, within the office of the CFO. There's also data analysts and data scientists. So it's really spread throughout the company, and over time, I think when I started, it was around 400 people, and now it's an order of magnitude larger.
What's the data science group?
The data science, so that's what I'm saying. It's kind of hard to count because it's so diffuse now across different parts of the org. My team operates since the time I started, it's operated in somewhat a similar way, where we're a product team essentially, and we are very focused, to your point, on shipping things in every quarter essentially, right? We have Google style. Google has this thing called OKRs, where you basically set objectives every quarter, and you should know what is the one thing that's most important that I'm working on right now, and similarly, we don't work on problems. We may work on problems that have a long time frame, but we don't work on things where the first deliverable is 2 years out. And so there should be some tangible value and some tangible business impact on those problems. To your point, you mentioned earlier this concept of having some business value right away. That's a pattern that I do see when we get big waves of interns over the summer, so people from PhD programs, and that's kind of how we keep that that flow going back and forth. And when I interview candidates, recent new grads, or when we have interns come in, that's the one piece I feel is often missing to a big extent, is focus on, well, is this really aligned with the mission of the company, and is it going to provide a lot of value? Because if you're doing that, you're putting resources on this project versus another one. And for example, like connecting people based on what kind of dogs they have or something silly like, I don't know, trying to think of a silly example, may not provide as much value as connecting people to, their next job.
Right. I mean, just you kind of span like the academic world and the sort of industry world a little bit. Like, how do you bring stuff across that gap? I mean, to companies.
I mean, this is an interesting question. I don't know that I have the best answer for it, because there's sort of there's sort of this tension between what industry wants to do and what academia wants to do, and finding like a balance that's mutually satisfying can definitely be very tricky. So I don't know if I have a great answer for this question, to be honest with you.
Well, I guess I'd ask, like, how much of your time is spent sort of reading papers and bringing that new theory or whatever to company X? And
I mean, so this goes back to it, right? Like, this is one of the things that I regret, which is I don't have my hands as deep in the literature as I used to. Like, I still keep like my finger on the pulse, but I'm not as deep into it as I was. And one of the first things that goes out in a lot of consulting engagements is people are like, we really just want this delivered tomorrow, and we don't really care, if you're using the most naive method that's available to you. And that really happens quite frequently. It's like we just want it solved. We don't even care, if you're going to get that last 5% of accuracy. So there's definitely a lot of I mean, it's definitely very common that you have to sacrifice a lot of just richness, and rigor. Yeah.
I think the interesting question really for Rob is sort of, where do you draw the line sort of between somebody like me, say, who writes really crappy code and sort of production? So if you're going to, if I'm going to get tasked off on trying to find some algorithm to do something, and we get to a point of, in like R or something where it works, how do you sort of make that transition from saying like, you've taken this far enough, I'm going to now sort of rationalize this into an engineering cycle? I mean, one of the examples is the DV counter paper, like the optimal DV counter paper, right? It's a really interesting distinct value counting paper. It's an interesting paper, but it actually doesn't have any engineering merit because you can't actually implement it with any real success. So it's interesting academically, but not interesting engineering-wise. So how do you as a CTO sort of balance that?
There's a few questions in that.
Sure.
The one question about like how do you take a rough proof of concept? Well, Matt writes the most funky Mathematica and R code that I have to interpret, which is always a hoot. I don't think I've ever successfully taken any of your Mathematica code or R code and actually implemented it. It normally involves us going to the whiteboard and like working through first principles again. But at least he's vetted out what the thing is. So what's hard about that project is my background has always been in production software. I have a firm belief in like you should build it, it should work, it should never like I don't get the call at 3 a.m. Like that's the way I write software. I just don't. I always dread the 3 a.m. call or being on pager duty or whatever. So that's been throughout my entire career. So now I just have this. I know how to build software that doesn't break. It may not be the most fancy or whatever, but I know how to build it so that it stays running. And then trying to take that proof of concept, which is a little wonky and it's got rough edges, and how do you integrate that in? And I don't think that there is a single solution to doing that. Like I think that there is, maybe you can find the people that bridge the gaps. And Timon has actually been great for us because he does sit between me, who tend to be highly on the programmatic side, and Matt, who tends to be highly on the theoretical side, and we have somebody who can talk in between the two of us. And sometimes you actually need that individual to help you do that translation layer. It's hard to find the one guy who can take it all the way from concept through production and make it stand up and make it scale and make it do everything else. So I wish that there was a great single answer to that, but I think it's through the disparate skill sets that you get, the richness that actually results in that. I think it's because Matt is good on the theory side, it's because I'm good on the engineering side, and it's because Timon can sit in the middle, that it works for us as a group.
I I've had that's another topic that comes up a lot at LinkedIn, especially. And like I said, we have these diverse teams, and I think it's different depending on what team you're in. For us, when I started, I would say it was much more towards that side. When LinkedIn was a smaller company, we had people who would write a prototype, and then that prototype would kind of go over the wall, and then and we had a lot of headaches with that process, right? Especially as you grow, because on the engineering side, engineers don't want to be code monkeys, right? And we actually hire a good number of engineers in machine learning and statistics capability, and on the other side, I've been on the other side where we have production code, and we get something from someone who did a prototype that's not really doesn't scale, right? Or you have an intern write something, and then to productionalize it, it doesn't scale. So we've actually moved more towards on our team. We build a prototype which actually is production ready, which it's a little strange, but the amount of energy that it takes to actually code something up once is, by the time you've done that, given those short cycles you mentioned, you might as well just build it for production. And so what that means is we have a big challenge if we get a new hire coming from a different background like physics or computational neuroscience or something. We actually then train them up in the building blocks of you can decouple it, so you can say, hey, you're going to write a MapReduce job, or you're going to learn how to do this, and you don't have to learn everything under the sun in computer science to actually implement a scalable algorithm these days.
Yeah, I think that's actually the important piece, is because 10 years ago, it wasn't the case that you had 100 frameworks. Like, if you were the guy implementing the algorithm, you might be writing an HTTPD, as part of that. Whereas now there's enough framework set up, and you can grab enough glue things that you're only writing the glue code rather than writing the entire infrastructure. Whereas, again, 10 years ago, that wasn't even feasible. So.
Actually, what are you seeing in companies out there? Is there a hard split between roles, or are these hybrid?
I think both approaches work. I mean, if I look back to sort of the Conviva example, which is the one I'm most familiar with, I think out of the 24 engineers we have, 22 of them are PhDs, and 22 of those were either PhD students or one or the other of the two founders. Both of them are, professors, and still sort of professors. And so you get in that situation, they do the models and they do production code. Does it create problems with production code? It probably does every now and then. But it's worked well for us. I think, but in other situations, I could see exactly when aggregate knowledge is the other end of the spectrum.
Ashu, what's been your experience with this? So I've heard this common theory that PhDs are not good engineers. So what has your experience been with that? Everyone says.
Would I dare say that in public here?
We're gonna have a riot in a second. We'll find out.
I mean, my answer is that there's truth in it, like as there is with a lot of these quotes or mottos or whatever. That there are definitely a lot of PhDs who are pretty bad engineers, and there are some that are great. But
but jokes apart, I think of engineering as a way of life. I think of it as a way of thinking. And so there's different kinds of engineers. I mean, I'm an engineer. I haven't written code for 25 years now. Definitely at Conviva, we tried having PhDs write the front end, the UI. That was not a good idea. So in that case, they were definitely terrible engineers. But on the other hand, all our production code is written by PhDs. And on the back end and the server side, it's worked great.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with that sentiment, which is there's just a varied set of skills that are out there. And just as Matt is on the more math side, and me going over there and attempting to trot around in his domain sometimes leads as just as bad of a result as if he's trying to trot in my domain. And again, I think that spectrum is what makes these work sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll back it up. I mean, I think when I introduced you this morning, I said you're a good cohort, but it's probably an individual thing.
I suck.
We make a decent team, I guess. But
Well, it's kind of like Spock and Scotty on the Enterprise.
there you go. Thanks, Pete. So maybe it's more individual. I don't know which one's which.
Who's Scotty?
That was good.
All right, thanks.
he's definitely anyway the odd couple.
So I have a less rosy question for all of you, which is how do you institutionalize failure? How do you take research which often goes down these dark alleys and comes out beat up for it? How do you take that and turn it into a learning experience or something useful? Because I mean, like at AK, we try to write about it, and that gives us something to look back and say at least we learned something. But that's one approach. There's got to be prepared companies.
Yeah. I'm a big proponent of learning from failures and building those areas. And so what I do on a project is I typically write a post-mortem. Well, as part of the OKR process, every quarter you write up how things went. But when a project is actually paused or canceled or something like that, I write up a detailed. Well, what would we have done differently? How could we have seen this? What did we take away from it? So the other thing that's a great thing that comes from research is negative results, right? There's huge value, there's huge IP even in that because now right? And your competitor may not know, right? And they may go down that road. So now you know something valuable. And even in projects that pause, like we've spawned off entire new things where an example would be we had some projects that look at career pathing and the way that people evolve in their jobs. And from a product perspective, it needs more work, but the underlying research that we got out of that was immensely valuable for job matching and got implemented in a number of places. And so it can be hard. That's the other part, which maybe is worth talking about, which is it can be hard to quantify, especially some of this back-end stuff. It's one thing if you're a back-end focused company and that's what you're selling. But if you're a company where there's some algorithm improvements that then flow into your wider product and you have people over here working on those algorithm improvements, how do you measure? It may be hard, to predict what's going to happen to get that sign off from the CTO or whoever. And then B, how do you actually turn that into a dollar value and express it to the powers that be? And I'm curious if people have any ideas on that.
Sorry, I was just thinking about your sentiment. It's exactly about knowing something your competitor doesn't know. I just not to tangent here real quick, but I just watched a 4K print of Raiders of the Lost Ark the other day, and this 4K digital stuff is great. But it just reminds me of that whole scene where Sala says they're digging in the wrong place, and then they're expending all that effort in that other place, trying to unearth something, and you're over here like actually progressing forward. There's a lot of value in that failure to know that failure exists, and the fact that you failed faster than your competitor failed, and then you were able to leapfrog ahead. So that to me is fantastic. I actually thought that about some of the products that we had used in the past. People were trying to use, in order to do large set combinations, they were trying to use word-align hybrid and a lot of these other techniques in order to do set unions and so forth. And we learned really quickly that they just get so large so fast. And it was awesome to have failed very fast at doing that technique so that we could jump to the next one, which is something like hyperlog log, which then allowed us to move that much forward faster. And I always say this to Timon is let's fail as quickly as humanly possible so that we can get to the next step. So how fast can you fail so that you can move to that next step?
I do want to point out that there's a risk of confusing negative results with failure to find. And failure to find is one of those things you keep wanting to maybe press forward. At least in my experience, I guess I've had the luxury of scoping things strictly in advance and trying to define what I would consider failure conditions. I don't know if everyone else has this sort of luxury, but I've been pretty hard-nosed about it, trying to do this in advance.
I've seen that as well, which is an anti-pattern, which is a team that maybe didn't have the expertise or you didn't have Matt or whatever to dig into the algorithms, and you tried something and said, okay, well, it doesn't work. And I've had people on non-data science teams say, oh, we tried that direction a few years ago, it's not going to work. But just because someone tried something in the past doesn't mean that it's not going to work in the future. You never know how they implemented it, what happened.
I think that's I spend a fair amount of time making sure that when we say we fail, we really mean we fail. I think it's actually hard to define failure as, a character was placed wrong in your test code and all of a sudden all your intersections look like they're 30% off when they're really not. So defining failure is actually something I think is really important for a person in my role. But I'd be curious from Ashu's perspective. Aggregate Knowledge went through sort of a reboot a few years ago, a little bit of change of direction. How do you sort of, when you look at your portfolio, is there a point when you say, you guys are doing something interesting, but if you just slightly changed it, it would be more interesting? Or how do you sort of guide your companies as a board member?
It's obviously case dependent, very case specific. But I think in most cases, at least I try less to guide the company and more to assess whether the CEO and the rest of his team actually know what they're doing. Because that's the judgment call. You're trying to test their judgment most of the time. And so I'm a big believer in sort of running a lot of thought experiments in the board meeting and asking a lot of what if questions. Not because I know whether the answers are right or wrong, because 99% of the time I have no idea whether the answer will be right or wrong. But just trying to get a sense of, is this person sort of exercising judgment? And if you get a sense the person has the right balance of judgment, and then you go with it. And hopefully you're right more often than you're wrong. But in almost every case, every company I've invested in, the team knows way more about the problem than I do. They're way smarter than I am, and they're way more determined than I am to go make it happen.
Wouldn't you actually be scared if you knew more than the team
Absolutely.
did?
That'd probably be a bad investment.
Yes.
So it looks like we have a little bit less than 10 minutes. I have a couple of questions that I could ask these guys, but I was wondering if we maybe have 10 minutes of questions from the audience, if anyone wants to ask anything.
I was wondering if you guys could talk a bit about sort of evangelizing adoption once you have something that you think works, and either A, like getting people convinced, like maybe there's a migration cost, maybe he's throwing out code that somebody else has written and they're kind of attached to it, and maybe accepting that, you know what, maybe the thing I made isn't better and I'm just attached to it, and how do you distinguish between the two?
So actually, Timon's going to give a lightning talk at the end of this thing, which is it sort of touches on some of that stuff. But also, I think Rob's probably uniquely positioned to answer this. From our perspective, we've done a lot of work on streaming, sketching stuff, and we talk about it in the blog and that kind of thing. A lot of that really comes from the CTO.
Yeah, it's. I can speak to the obvious stuff that we do. Like, we specifically didn't go down a map reduce route and so forth. We went streaming and so forth, and that's actually really hard. Dave, my boss, actually has to spend time in meetings explaining to customers as to why this approach is better and why the hell should they care. They get a report
And board members.
And board members. At the end of the day, did your report come out and is it better, faster, cheaper than the other guy? Should be what it is. And there, I constantly have to deal with that stigma, and is it worth the time that he spends in meetings trying to explain to people this rather than explaining about value proposition? So there's anti-value there, but on the flip side, and that's why that we've tried to counteract that by putting the blog posts out and to be as open as possible about these things, and to have a conference like this and to try to get people excited and try to give people really. That's why most of our sketching, all of our sketching things have demos on them. It's you want to be able to have this visceral feel about what this thing is. So it's as soon as you look at it, it's yeah, of course, this is awesome, and then you jump to it. I forget we were talking to a guy over there during lunch, and he was asking when you bring new people on, if we bring a map reduce person on, what is that like when we're a sketch house? How do they get to that? And I'm what's funny is when you sit somebody down with this, they have the same initial reactions that we have, which is this stuff can't work. What the hell are you talking about? And then you play with it the first time, and then you really play with it, and you go, wow, this is really exciting. And I think that's why I've stuck so far behind these ideas that we've had. Is because they do work, and you do sit down and you go, oh, and am I disillusioning myself in this? It's hard to say, but every time that I test a friend, I test a colleague, am I thinking about this the wrong way? And when I get that positive feedback, but yeah, the echo chamber can be really loud, especially in a large company. It's we should continue to do this because we should, and change cost is high, and we should continue to press forward. It's easy to have those thoughts.
I think what jumps to mind for me for that one is there was a great quote the other day. It was something like, a prototype is worth 1,000 words, right? So if you can actually, sometimes it just is a matter of buckling down. If you really believe that much in your idea, going the extra mile. And there's a danger here too, where it can go too long. So you don't let a prototype isn't something that you spend a year on. It's something that you maybe spend a few weeks on. We have hack days once a month. And often people have an idea and they do a prototype and they answer it there because it gets some distribution. Blogging is also great, open sourcing stuff. But within a company, I find having a live prototype, doing some analysis and having some, ballpark back of the envelope estimates can go a long way if you're in a data-driven company.
Actually, kind of curious to turn this on Joseph. Like, do you see sort of an equivalence of like an algorithm that way? Like people always talk about like support vector machines are the cool thing, or like decision trees are the cool thing. Is there sort of a flow through sort of the machine learning world where all of a sudden like the new pretty toy becomes the thing that you really evangelize or you believe in is the right approach to sort of solving problems?
I mean, I guess that would be the case, right? Because like since the Netflix prize, we've realized that ensembles are a pretty decent state-of-the-art benchmark for a lot of tasks. So it's sort of like, and Kaggle has also shown like, yeah, just use random forests and that'll probably be good enough for most cases. It's definitely at the point that deep learning, which is sort of the new hot topic and sort of what I did my postdoc on, that is not yet off the shelf, but I think it's really driven by can I use the code off the shelf and have other people proven it? At that point, it's like then it becomes common knowledge that's good to use it.
I wanted to just step back a little bit to what you guys were just talking about, and I'm wondering at more of the company level, how do you guys close the feedback loop between research divisions and product in terms of making sure research isn't kind of going down this rabbit hole of like, well, we're really working on this interesting problem, and product's like, oh, but it's actually not. It's really a problem in production. Our customers don't even care about this. To make sure that kind of you guys are both kind of in sync on what's important, what's interesting, what's relevant to the company as well, just to make sure it's not cost allocated.
I'll give just a quick.
Can I just jump in quickly? Yeah, I mean, this goes back to what I was saying before, that in the actual definition of the research agenda, I think you should include the stakeholders, whether it's the technology people because it'll be a technological advantage, or the business people because you believe it'll provide business value. But I think that all the stakeholders should be part of the problem definition stage.
I was going to say, in our world of aggregate knowledge, it's a little bit, and I'm sure a lot of you are in this position, it's a little bit scary to do R&D because, for instance, for like a sketching back end for our reporting, if that fails, we wasted a ton of time, and that really sucks when you only have like 3 or 4 resources that can actually work on this. So I think from a company of our size, it really means that you have to have decent, leadership or guys who are been around the block a little bit, who can make those assessments early on and say, look, even though it looks bad right now, it's worth continuing forward because there's so much business value that could be pulled out of it. But that's just ours. I'd be curious what Pete has to say about it.
Leadership, that is exactly what I was going to say as well. You, especially as a company grows, I think that's just so important to have leaders who are keeping an eye on these things and have been around the block. And I think within any company, it may be hard to identify for execs who that set of people is exactly. But there is a set of people who, it's kind of like investors, I guess. Good investors, they tend to, in theory, if good investors exist, they tend to make good bets over time. So you want to keep an eye on that, like how, when they say this is how you should do it, does it actually end up working? And start putting a little bit more faith in their judgment. And ideally, you have those people kind of overseeing, I think, so that you don't have 20 people running in different directions, right?
We probably have time for one more question. Oops.
There's anything you can comment on what are really the big research questions you see in data science that I'd like to hear about? I don't quite see a lot of these questions.
So, what are the big research questions in data science?
One other question is you can answer either one of the two. So, can you give me examples of investments you make only in data science? Not in platform, not in application, where is the VC investment in data science?
So where is a VC investment in data science?
So I'm actually not sure I understand. Like when you say only in data science, but not in platforms, not in applications, what would be an example of only in data science?
Well, maybe like a startup doing recommendation engines or something. I guess it's all platform.
Well, that's still an application.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, as investors, we're looking. I mean, I hate to make this sound crass. I'm looking to put in $5 million and get 500 out. Everything else is mechanics. It's a means to an end. So, yeah. So
No, I mean, I was told that the best pitch for a VC is you come in with a box and you put it on the table and you put in a penny, you pull the crank, and out comes a nickel. And then he wants to invest. And he'll ask you 3 questions. He'll be like, is it legal? How quickly can I put the pennies in? And how many
is
can
it
I
scalable, replicable? So
Can I put the nickel back in and double that?
Listen, so a lot of data sets look like cost part of it, or it's operation part of it. And so I don't know how much directly we should think about that.
I think to be fair, jokes apart, I mean, there's lots of technologies that are revenue generating. I think there are lots of companies that are seeking to sort of whack costs out of the system. And again, I think the real question is it a project that can translate into a business?
I mean, so one thing, I mean, I've looked at this problem a lot. It's definitely quite interesting. Like, one thing I've noticed is that I don't know any real successes in terms of data science pure plays. The people have had to take data science and productize and put it in an application, maybe in a particular vertical, and then it becomes valuable. But I had, for one of my friends, I'm not going to name his company, he did a recommendation engine company, and then he realized his customers didn't really get it, and he was just building shopping carts for them.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of technology in search of a problem. Kind of when I hear pure data science play. Data science, I guess it's like you said, research and startup is kind of broad, right? For myself, what I think is interesting right now, I think the deep learning stuff is really interesting. It was interesting 5 years ago, and I think now with what Google's doing, I think that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, but the other thing you have to keep in mind is that the sort of people who are smart enough to know that they need machine learning or natural language processing are also arrogant enough to want to build it themselves. So,
it's a great point.
A lot of the issues we talk about here can be practical for a company to find, for example, the key position for your VP of product or your product people. How do you guys identify what kind of person, what kind of right skill or something about the person that the stage for the product lead?
So the question for those who didn't hear that, the question was, how do you figure out someone's the right fit for a VP of product position, sort of for the product leader? There's easy ways. You look at someone's track record and experience, and if they've done it 5 times before, they're probably likely to do it the 6th time, blah, blah, blah. I think, but it's really situation specific is the real answer. There's no formula. I'm picking on Conviva again and again as an example, but in Conviva, for example, for the longest time, our product leader was one of the PhDs who had been an engineer for 10 years. But he was one of the few people who actually understood what the product did. And we needed a product leader for a long time who could actually figure out what the engineers were doing. At some point, in fact, relatively recently, we made a transition. And we actually brought in a product leader from outside who had spent the last 10 years taking technology to market and thinking about packaging and pricing. Because those were skills that now were very important to us. Figuring out what level of abstraction should a new innovation be. Should we create a new product, or should we make it a module within the existing product? And those things, you don't want someone to learn on your dime. Those aren't first principle decisions. Those are experience-based decisions. So for those, given that the company was at that stage of evolution, we hired someone who'd been there and done it 5 times. So I think it'll depend on the situation and the stage of the company.
Thanks. I think that's pretty much all the time we have, actually. So thanks to all the panel speakers. Thanks for listening. Thank you.
Thanks.